Hello, and welcome to the early 19th century lecture. So what we're going to do with this lecture is I'm going to give a little bit of overview of the whole of the 19th century, sort of what we're looking at, because some of the themes of the 19th century are true throughout the whole thing. If we come up with something that I need to sort of expound on within the certain eras that we're talking about, I'll stop and I'll show you those a little bit. So let's go ahead and get started. So some of the major trends of the 19th century that we've seen is war. War is a big deal in the 19th century, especially war of expansion, war of liberation, war of revolution, war of rebellion. We see a lot of indigenous people trying to take back what has been taken from them, especially in Africa. That's going to get bigger in the 20th century. In Southeast Asia, it's huge, and then we see it again in the 20th century. And we also see these sort of internecine wars, the wars inside of countries, so civil wars, etc. The big ones that are really going to affect what we're talking about today are the French Revolution and the American Civil War a little bit because of how it affected trade. And that is the big thing behind these sorts of wars is how does it affect clothing? So not only does it affect trade, how do materials get from one place to another. During the American Civil War, the cotton trade stopped. Cotton was not making it to the textile mills in New England from the South where it was being processed. It wasn't traveling across to across to Great Britain as easily. We also see the stop of flow of ideas that often war shuts down sort of communication between countries. Even whenever it's interior civil wars, whenever a country is going through a civil war, they're not necessarily talking to their neighbors, really. And we see this in the French Revolution. Throughout history, that you might have noticed the 17th and 18th and a bit of the 19th, you might have seen sort of friendly, unfriendly, what's that called? Sort of rivalry between France and England. Uh, there was war, yes, but there was also sort of this competition and mix mashing. This stops during the French Revolution. So we don't see this Britain and France developing styles together. There was a bit of a spread out of styles, of period styles, clothing styles. So we're going to start talking first about the French Revolution coming up here in a second, and then the Napoleonic Wars. French Revolution in 1789. The events leading to the French Revolution have been brewing for some time. This is financial crisis, bad weather, crop failure, starvation, that people were this sort of endemic classist society where the aristocrats got everything and the people got nothing. That sort of idea of the inherited right of kings, that I'm an aristocrat because God deems me to be an aristocrat, not because I have the luck of birth. We see that a little bit today, not with the aristocracy. We're going to talk a little bit when we get into the 20th century about the American ideal of the classless society. We see that at any sort of dissent got people sent to the Bastille. So there was no sort of justice, there was no liberty, so this is the basis for what's going to happen here in a second with the French Revolution is that the poor people, the bourgeoisie that have been downtrodden, have been starved, have been stripped of their rights, purely rise up and kill a lot of people. The storming of the Bastille in 1789 is usually regarded as the official beginning. Here's an image of it. If you've ever seen Les Mis. From 1789 to 1792, there was a National Assembly worked out major reforms. A lot of these reforms were kind of based on Greek and Roman government, the sort of antecedents to democracy that we saw. But of course, just like Greek and Roman democracy, it was white landowning men that could vote that were controlling this government. They tried to establish a constitutional monarchy. Louis the XVI was stupid. He pretended to cooperate, fled the country, and then he was caught and imprisoned and eventually beheaded. This is the era of Madame Guillotine. France declared itself a republic in 1792. It attacked Austria. The best way to consolidate and to get people facing your people to face the same direction is to cause a nationalist war. I mean, that has happened over and over again. We can see here an image of the guillotine um, and people being kind of happy about it. The Republic was put together. This is a dictatorial socialist state. We discover at this time once the blood begins to flow, it doesn't stop easily. This is pretty disgusting what happened at this time period. It was called the Terror because um, any whiff of revolution, any whiff of any sort of whisper of dissent, any sort of whisper of blue blood of aristocracy, you were going to die. This is a time period of friends and family ratting each other out for the good of the people, is what they said. That thousands of people lost their heads for suspicion, and we see this again. This is not new, and nor is it old to human history. We see this in the pogroms. We see this in Stalinish Russia. We see it in the Khmer Rouge. We see it in these sort of dictatorial overthrows of government. The first thing they do is they purge dissents. And then in 1973 or 1793, Marie Antoinette and Louis the 16th were beheaded. When the excess of the revolution, a republic became too much, another revolution, and the government was replaced by the Directoire. It was a committee, so you can see them here, a five-man committee. The interesting thing about the Directoire, as you might have noticed in your textbook, is that they pulled together the estates, so the first estate, the second estate, the third estate, and the fourth estate. So it's the aristocracy, the priesthood, the bourgeoisie, the poor, the bourgeoisie and the working man, and then the press. And they said, well, you have to wear these specific clothing. And the working man said, no, we don't. So that, of course, again, sort of trying to identify who you are by what you can and cannot wear. Uh, they went to, of course, they went to war with the rest of Europe, moderately successful because of outstanding young military leaders like Napoleon Bonaparte. Um, he was a spectacular general. I mean, he was amazing at creating opportunities and waging war. For being an emperor, he was kind of he had this great sort of idea of what France could be. He modeled his regime after the Roman Empire, as we can kind of see here. There's a lot of images. I don't think I have one of Napoleon wearing a laurel crown, kind of like Caesar. You can see his hair is a little like the statues of Caesar. That he sort of very much saw himself as an emperor general. But he did these great things. Like I think we're going to talk about this a little bit more later, so I'm just going to gloss quick. But he sort of promoted French goods. He changed how trade happened. He kind of forced people to be French, which was a great thing for not only morale but also for trade and economy. He did a really smart thing there. Of course, he went bad, but we'll talk about that in a second. The other thing that we see throughout the 19th century is this idea of expansion and empire. We see the United States westward expansion, go west, young man. The terrifying idea of manifest destiny, that providence, that God has said we must control sea to sea. We must overspread the continent, multiplying millions. That you know that this has been mandated by the Lord, that we need to go out. And you'll notice in this image, this is personification of manifest destiny, that they are driving the natives in front of them. That progress is the godless heathens are being pushed pushed out by progress, and we are bringing the sort of civilization, I guess, is a great what they would consider civilization. We also see the consolidation of the German Empire, the expansion of the British Empire, colonialism, Italian unification, the French Empire created like Napoleon, like we just saw. And this is sort of setting the tone that we've seen the beginnings of nationalism and the idea of a national identity, but this is really putting together that idea that we are a people, we are solid people. Of course, this is going to cause trouble in the 20th century. We see Austria-Hungary. It's not very big in clothing history, but we see that be put together. Austria and Hungary come together as one. Um, but all of this sort of nationalism is going to cause us trouble in the near future. It's not kings waging war on kings; it's nations waging war on nations. The French Empire, first 15 years in the 19th century, continuous war to Europe as Napoleon tried to expand French dominion. He wanted to take over Europe and make it all French. Again, oh, here's the laurel wreath up here, um, which I find this finger hysterical. I don't know what it is, but I love it. So this is him. This is Napoleon's family system, and you can see. So this is ruled by Napoleon. This is ruled by his brother, is Spain, and then this is ruled by brother-in-law, nephew, or father-in-law, and these are the satellite states. Isn't that hysterical? Ottoman Empire down here, Russian Empire. He crowned himself emperor in 1804 and fought to control all of Europe directly through his many relatives. Um, and then he went into Russia, which is stupid, and then he got defeated at Waterloo in 1815. The Second French Empire, Louis Napoleon III came to the throne in 1848. Married, tried to get legitimacy by marrying a countess, as we see here in this image. Uh, the idea of court came back, dazzling court that was a social, sort of a social place. And then luxury goods, fine fabrics, so again, French identity of the finest of things comes back once more. Um, Kind of fell apart again. Prussia attacked France in 1870 to take control of the Rhineland, which is between the two countries. France lost, super lost, because Napoleon's progeny was not as good at war as the rest as Napoleon was. And then they tried to establish a republic after many centuries of monarchy. Fortunately, the governments kind of came and went and rotated through, but art and luxury industries thrived and survived. So again, and that's another thing that happened with war a lot, is that the modes of production were attacked as well, especially in internecine wars, inside wars. That you didn't just attack your enemies; you attacked your enemy's livelihood. So often we'll see that in World War One and World War Two, that livelihoods were attacked as well. Um, and that's whenever you start to talk about a moral war, yeah, I don't know. So the rise of the British Empire. Britain expanded its power into India, Southern Africa, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, um, mostly because of we need the British needed materials for manufacturing. So what we were saying is that Britain was conquering these countries and bringing the materials back, manufacturing in Britain, and then shipping them back to the countries. And you see down here, we'll see the big version of this, but sort of this is Britannia, the embodiment of Britannia, and these different sovereign nations looking and enduring terror and wonder at Britain sitting on the world. So here's the whole thing, um, kind of terrifying. Freedom, fraternity, and federation, except for, Um, at its height, it was the largest empire in history, and for over a century was the foremost global power. By 1922, British Empire held sway over 458 million people, one fifth of the world's population at the time. That didn't last much longer than World War II. Um, a lot of how we think is sort of in the world is based on British thought. Society is kind of based on British legacy, the empire on which the sun never sets, um, because of its enormity. Here's another image of the personification of Britannia. And I found it interesting. When I was putting this together, this sort of sparked a little bit of, it echoed something else. And you'll find I'm sure this happens to you guys being college students, that one thing will echo in another thing in another class. And it's sort of spectacular when it happens. But with the sort of helmet here and holding a spear reminded me of the statue of Pallas Athena. So we're going to talk about neoclassicism in a second, but this idea that Britain bases its power on ancient reasoning, I found kind of interesting. Um, and when we talk to neoclassicism about neoclassicism in a second, we're going to talk about that. So this image comes from the book called The History of Imperial Assemblage at Delhi in 1877. Queen Victoria was declared Empress of India, and so there was a traditional ceremony, a Durbar ceremony, where they pay their respects to their leader. So Queen Victoria never visited India, but um, it, Benjamin Disraeli stood in for him, and I think that's him right here. So this sort of pomp and circumstance is part of the British Empire. This need to be sort of big, this need for sovereignty, I guess, is a good word for it. This need for control is a good word for it. Um, from the Cape to Cairo, this is a Puck magazine, and you'll notice that it's sort of bringing the light of civilization, and conquering barbarism. Yeah, yuck. Another thing that we see a lot in the 19th century is the importation of exotic materials. This goes hand in hand with the idea of empire. We need to go out and have control. We can't just trade legit. We have to have control of these modes of production. So we see textiles being imported from India, China, Japan, gold from Canada, and South America. Trims and lace, Brussels lace is being made in India and China and Japan at this time. Beads, feathers. I put an article in our supplementary links page that I post every time, that has an article about the sort of mass nearby extinction of exotic birds, that it was enormous how many birds were massacred to go on hats during the Victorian age, and that sparked a conservation movement that caused saving of birds. We see furs, fibers, cashmere comes from cashmere goats, Kashmiri goats became popular. Furs were really popular at this time. And lots of gems and semi precious gems were being imported and put on clothing for the most part. This is the beginning of the American ascendancy. We see an influx of immigrants at this time, from various parts, and it comes in waves. So the Irish and the Scottish came, and then the Germans came, and then the French came, and then the British. Yeah, so there's this influx of immigrants. We know that there was a definite influx of immigrants up here in Northeast Wisconsin from sort of the Norwegian countries, so from Finnish, from Finland, from Sweden, from Norway, which I find super funny, or not funny, super interesting, because back home where I'm from in Pennsylvania, it was Germans, it was Hungarians, and it was Irish. Not a lot of Italians for a bit. So how people settled in America is a really interesting way to study these waves of immigrants. And these waves of immigrants brought trade. They brought skills that were needed to sort of bolster the expansion west. They brought the kind of do or die attitude that is surprisingly wonderful, a good part of America. Discovery of gold in the West, the invention of trains, the rise of heavy industry and exportation of goods really caused America to um, throw off this idea of a backward nation, which is kind of what we were until the 1950s. The idea that Americans were sort of like bumpkins almost, but we see that changing at this time period. The American Civil War again is a big has a big effect on trade, on clothing. Um, the American Civil War is not just about slavery, but also about state sovereignty and Southern cotton versus Northern textile mill. So again, trade is sort of driving how people are living. Industry and railroads are enormous at this time period. So manufacturing and industry become faster, become cheaper, harder on people and the environment. Um, it was sort of hardest. Industry was kind of hardest on women and children. That there was no children labor laws. There was no labor laws at all. You worked from dawn till dusk in very dangerous conditions. There was no OSHA to protect you. This is a image, and I have a couple more coming up of a young girl working in a textile mill. She's not getting an education. She's not going to school. She's not preparing for a future. She's working in a textile mill. And this happened throughout most of the 19th century. If any of you have ever read Charles Dickens or Sinclair Lewis, there's a lot of truth that is in there. Another thing that sort of sped along the uh, the industrial revolution is the development of the Bessemer process in steel manufacture. So before the Bessemer process, and this was a Scottish process that Carnegie got his hands on and sort of imported to America. Um, that the Bessemer process beforehand, that steel was not necessarily good. It was brittle. It had a lot of impurities. It would break easily, and you couldn't make a whole bunch of it because it was you needed a lot of processing to get it to be what it was. But the Bessemer process, developed by this dude named Bessemer, was really inexpensive. It was kind of brilliant innovation in the way to mass produce steel. So what he did is he blew air over the steel, and it helped burn off impurities and help keep the steel molten longer. And the longer you can keep the steel molten, the stronger it is, the less impurities in it, and the more you can do with it. So that instead of just pouring 2-foot chunks of railroad ties or railroad track, you could pour 40 feet of it, and you could and that made it like lit the fire underneath American expansion at that point. Railroad building boomed in the second half of the 19th century, and that sort of changed how we saw America. The connections between America became very, very short. We are also seeing the telegraph be developed at this time. The sort of regulated governmental um, services are becoming more and more regular. Uh, train schedules became regular, that all of this was kind of put together to make travel, trade, um, life more efficient for Americans and for Britons and for India and for, the development of the train system, railroad system, spread across the country really quickly. And wonderfully, people took trains to resorts for vacations. People um, were convenient. People could go from New York to San Francisco in a matter of weeks rather than months. And travel became less dangerous. Um, and so the westward expansion sped up because of this. Um, the fashion industry became industrialized, and we're going to talk about this a good bit whenever we get to the end of the week this week, because it's sort of, after doing fashion this, it's sort of like my new picadillo. Um, Machinery was taking place of the old form of work. Spread of knowledge, cheaper books, methods of transportation, but it also had its downside, that people were people were a commodity. They didn't have a voice in the means of production. We're going to see that change shortly. Um, Machinery was made materials more plentiful and less expensive. So we see people moving out of agricultural frames into urban centers where manufacturing was. So we're starting to see, rather than a family sitting down and weaving, spinning, shearing, creating the fibers that they need, which, as we discovered, takes a long, long time. They were able to create these fabrics quickly, plentifully, cheaply, as we see here. Um, Not very safely, of course, but that these were created more plentifully, so people had more time to do other things. People had time to go and work in the factories. People had time to go in. We're starting to see the idea of leisure up here. That's going to come to fruition. That's not the word I want. Um, in the early 20th century, but we're starting to see that idea that labor is not necessarily the be all and end all. We see batiste, muslin, organdy, berger, woolen silk material used for clothing, gauze, crepe, and tulle were trims and lace, and all of this is being created by machinery, which makes it less expensive. We're going to see shortly that there was an explosion of, especially in the middle class and upper middle class and the upper class, about clothing, the need to change clothes over and over and over again. This was this was helped along by mechanization, that you could get clothes, you could get a different outfit relatively inexpensively, relatively quickly. Um, for like, you could get a new outfit for every 2 hours of the day. We're going to see that in a second. This is also the rise of the ready-mades. Oh, here it is. The rise of the ready-mades. We saw men's ready-mades sort of come to their own in the last century, in the 18th century, but we really see ready-mades kind of explode at this time. You could buy clothes off the rack, kind of how we buy clothes today. um, this was a brand new thing, that you weren't there was not a dressmaker that made your dress. That was the idea of having a dressmaker make your clothing has gone up into the stratosphere, that the aristocracy, it was reserved for the aristocracy. Normal people, regular working day people, could go into a store, could go to a catalog and buy a full outfit, and need to tailor very minimally. Menswear was produced in large quantities, and it did not really need the intricate fitting that women's dresses required. We'll see that in a little bit as well. The sewing machine. The invention of the sewing machine changed, again, changed how women live their lives. Before the sewing machine, a lot of work was done by hand. Even even kind of like landed gentry, even the upper class, had to do work by hand. But the invention of the sewing machine sort of changed how we created clothes. Um, Clothing manufacturers were the first sewing machine customers, um, and they produce ready to wear clothing, not bespoke clothing, not clothing made specifically for a person, but for a size. Um, in the 1860s, consumers started to buy them, and they were expensive, but again, they're going to change how much time you spend during your day doing clothing. Um, we see the birth of dress patterns. You can watch this video. It shows you the how a sewing machine works. So these are some of the early sewing machines. You'll notice that they're hand cranked. They're not foot pressured, foot pedaled. Foot pedals came in treadle. Foot pedals came in a couple of years later. But this is the sort of hand thing, hand cranked. And it's fascinating. They're fascinating. They still work today. The first sewing paper patterns were designed by De Morst, starting in 1860. Here's a copy of, so this is the Mirror of Fashion in 1865, the Illustrated Monthly. So people who are creating patterns are also setting the styles. So it's kind of, there's a movement to uniformity almost, that anybody can buy this and recreate these patterns, add different trim, and you'll have something special. Butterick, still a pattern company today. I just used a Butterick pattern a couple days ago. I was making something. The idea of a graded sewing pattern, that all of the sizes, a whole bunch of sizes, were placed in the same pattern for tissue on tissue paper. Um, they also added an instruction sheet, which they call the Deltor. Again, found fascinating. So this is what a de Morset pattern looks like. So this is the front of the jacket. This is I think this is the sleeve. Shows you where to attach with it. I could make this pattern today. I mean, this looks pretty much like the patterns I use today to create clothing. They're a little more detailed, they have a little more information on them than this, but yeah, I could probably make something. Might not fit anybody, but I could make it. And this is the delineator from Butterick. 15 cents. Synthetic dyes also sort of changed how we used our clothes, or how clothes work. Um, this idea of creating chemical dyes before this time, 1850s, before this time, clothing was dyed by hand with natural products. But they started, these sort of chemists started to work on chemical reactions of natural products. So we had the idea of aniline and indigo dyes. So the uh, first dye was called mauvine, which is, I think, this one right here. This is the second one, was indigo. That they, what happened? I'm not a chemist, so I can't really tell you exactly, but it's taking apart chemicals that exist, so like coal tar, and finding out, adding something else to it to see it turn colors, and powdering it, and then it's a mass produced dye. The problem with aniline dyes, and they've used aniline dyes for a very, very, very long time, is that it's highly carcinogenic. It makes you sick very quickly. We used to use aniline dyes in scene painting. I never had to. We had other stuff then. It was moving. It was out of favor once I became painting scenery, but the colors were gorgeous, which is why people loved it. You see that the the colors are becoming colors that you don't get in nature. And people love that. People love new. People love special. People love fantastic, fantastic colors. One of the colors that was from this aniline dye was created through arsenic. It's this sort of green color, And they would put arsenic in wallpaper, they would put arsenic in clothing, they would put arsenic in everything to get this green color. And they were wondering why people were getting sick. I could tell you why. Another great innovation was the safety pin, 1840, 1834. Walter Hunt. He invented the safety pin in 1849. Um, he didn't get to keep the patent though. He sold the rights and didn't keep it, so he didn't make the bucket of money that he wanted to. But again, something as simple as a pin, a spring-loaded pin, kind of changed how clothing worked. Mail-to-order catalogs again changed how we lived as human beings. That we could telegraph, we could mail, and um, get clothing, get a washing machine, get any number of things. I have one of these catalogs in my office. If anybody is around and wants to look at it, they're fascinating. That they all have these sort of. I have a couple Sears catalogs, but they have all these little drawings here that says, oh, if you want to buy this shirt, buy this waistcoat, buy this house, you could buy a house from Sears and Roebuck. I think Sears and Roebuck has said they're going to do that again, that all you need to do is have the land and you can put it together. So Montgomery Ward is another one, Sears and Roebuck, and there's a bunch of other ones. Sears and Roebuck is the only one that has kind of lasted until now. Montgomery Ward went out whenever I was in college. We don't have Montgomery Wards around anymore. The first department store was opened in 1850s. You could get everything you want in one place. Au Bon Marché was the first one in France, and sort of that again expanded throughout the world fairly quickly. Photography is another fantastic innovation that sort of changed fashion. 1839 is sort of the dawn of photographic history. We see daguerreotypes. So this is a daguerreotype. I don't really know much about the history of photography. I just know how awesome it is because then we can now actually look at pictures of clothing pieces rather than sort of like best guess with paintings. Excuse me. And so the daguerreotype, I've posted a couple links to the history of photography if you're interested in our supplementary links page. Tintype is the next one. It's kind of interesting that they go back and they kind of shade it a little bit. The ambrotype image on glass. And then the birth of fashion photography, dating back to 1860. I put this article in our supplemental links as well. Clementina Hardaway took pictures of her daughters dressed up and did costume tableaus with them. So this is kind of this is the birth of fashion photography. So let's talk a little bit about some of the general clothing styles of the late 18th, early 19th century. One of the major movements that you see in this time period is a working class style. So the the idea that the nobility of the working class is something that comes back again and again and again throughout our history. You'll see it a couple times coming up next in the 20th century, especially. Uh, you know that to be seen as noble, to be seen as wealthy, was seen as a bad thing. So they tried to dress down. It's also this idea of the power to the people, the power of the bourgeoisie, the power of the working class, the proletariat. That the revolution is for them, not for this sort of educated class that that it has taken that will take control. But to prove that the revolution is for the working class and for the poor, they dress like it. The nobility also did as well. Good way to disguise yourself to not be, so that you wouldn't be murdered, killed. So the nobility had a kind of uniform, and we saw this in the 18th century. It's just a holdover from the early 18th, mid to 18th century, that it was sort of a knee breeches, a waistcoat, a jacket for men, elaborate dresses with lots of corsetry and underpinnings for women. But to hide, to show solidarity, people started to dress more plain. It was the sans culottes, trousers. So it was trousers like this instead of knee breeches, um, a neckerchief, a rosette on your tricorner hat, uh, this sort of sack coat rather than a cutaway, um, sort of a very plain looking, and then what are these? These are like mule slippers almost instead of boots. Um, so it was simplified. English influence, so that's another way the nobility kind of saved themselves was by dressing English. And above all, it was patriotic. That a lot of this clothing, you had to prove that you were patriotic. So this here is they talk about a cockade. So this is a cockade or a rosette is another way I've heard of it. The tricolor. So this is the Republican regime that white went away. White was the color of the nobility, but to show all three, white stayed, but they added the red and the blue for Paris colors. So this is the Republican regime tricolor. And you'll notice that a lot of the revolutionary clothes were very much red, white, and blue. We're very, very French and we are pro republic. This is the bonnet rouge that the book talks about. So it's this sort of like peasant cap with the cockade on it. Again, very patriotic, very proletarian. We also see neoclassicism. This is a big clothing movement of this time period. We're rediscovering, people are rediscovering neoclassical or classical works from the Greek and Romans, and they're using them to sort of influence the creation of the Republic. We saw this during the American Revolution as well. That the American Revolution, the founding fathers were very well versed in ancient texts. So this idea of the rights of man, the idea of democracy, the idea of one vote from each person, white males, thank you. Um, that or thank God things have changed. Um, that this all came from ancient Greek thought. So we see this sort of looking back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome as an ideal, a revival, a neoclassical revival. We see this in the clothing. So this is a 5th century BCE high tide waist. It's a chiton with a little bit of with a drape around it, so we could see that over here. High waisted chiton esque little shoulder caps there, but kind of straight and clingy. So they're recreating, the clothing is recreating what they perceive is Greek and Romans war. Not necessarily, as we've noticed, not necessarily the truth. It's also the other reason, an interesting reason why these are all white is that the colors have faded off of statuary and stuff. So they assume that Greeks and Romans all wore white clothing. So we see this is a neoclassical style of empire, directoire and empire. We also see it in architecture. So this is l'Église de la Madeleine, built in 1823. We see the Parthenon kind of looks the same. Again, some more of this sort of neoclassical looks, even up to even including the hair, including the this sort of subject matter for art as well. It becomes really popular. Fashions for the period are known for the disclosure of the natural body. The corsets kind of went away. The very stiff bone corsets that we saw in the 18th century went away. They would wear stays, something to keep because not a lot of people had that sort of perfect figure. So they would have some underpinnings, just to kind of help keep things where it belongs. But a lot of that underclothes went away. The sort of stiffening went away, and the baskets and the heavy bum roller bustles, baskets, and all that stuff disappeared in this late 17th, early 18th century, or late 18th, early 19th century. Um, but we're going to see them. We'll see that come back. Don't worry. Uh, and the waistline raised up. A couple men tried togas, but discovered that they were awful. So they didn't. They were cold and they didn't really fit well. So they didn't. The togas didn't stick around too much. The way that you kind of see. Here's another image of this sort of high waisted. This is 1870s. The fichu, which is this piece of fabric around here. This is almost like a robe anglais. Pretty soon we're going to see this piece disappear, this piece of fabric disappear, and we're going to see just this part. It's going to turn into a Spencer jacket. We'll see that in a second. The main influence for men was haircuts modeled on Roman statues. So we see this sort of Napoleonic look, um, kind of brush forward look, but nothing much more than that. Um, we come to the other thing that we see at this time period, a general thing that we see at this time period is sort of um, extremism, and this happens a lot whenever bad things are happening, whenever things are going badly. That the youth to kind of separate themselves from this bad thing will go crazy almost. And we see this in sort of during the terror, the Republic right after the fall of the aristocracy, and during the Directoire, the rise of the incroyable and the mauvais, the marvelous one and the incredibles, and it was sort of they were taking what was the style of the time and going super far. So this is the Café de Incroyable, and you'll notice that really tight, lots and lots of layers, high stocks, and they're just crazy. We'll see this again and again, this sort of craziness again and again. One of the discussion questions asks, "What is our modern equivalent? Is there a modern equivalent to this?" The funny thing is that they wanted, they wanted to be as tight as possible, so had people paint boots on them. Women would wear these sort of skin tight with their either nothing underneath, or they would wear nude tights almost to show that they're very Grecian. Um, Intentionally bizarre manner parodying fashionable dress. This is one of my favorite clothing styles um, ever because it's just so out there. Uh, Garments were ridiculously oversized or ridiculously skimpy, like skin tight breeches, um, and just everything was outsized, out created. It was a way that they showed they didn't care. Um, they added grotesque touches like narrow ribbons around their necks to suggest the cut of the guillotine. One of the apocryphal stories, I haven't really seen it like super, like I haven't really seen it for reals, but one of the stories is to get this sort of Grecian, now this is really Grecian clinging muslin style that women would drench themselves so they would get wet so that the clothing hung to them. Now, I haven't seen this proved anywhere. It was just probably like propaganda story, but it's kind of hysterical that women would like get drenched, go outside, catch cold, and die. Because as we see in a second, that's kind of an ideal in the Victorian age is this sort of sickliness. Um, so yeah, I think they're spectacular. I think they're super fun, and why not? We also see kind of in the same frame of reference, but a little better put together is the idea of the dandy. Now, the dandy is like a beau or a gallant. We saw this in the Chevalier of the 18th century. So they dress really well. They are the highest society, or they're aspirational in high society, witty, urbane. They're the ones you invite to the parties. They're the ones that you want to be around, and they just put themselves together really well. So this is Robert de Montesquieu, This is sort of the dandy look, which is really, really nice. And there's two famous dandies that we see. And we see people like Lord Byron. Shelley was a bit of a dandy. Uh, the Oscar Wilde is a great example of a dandy. Yeah, for those of you who know Oscar Wilde at all, I didn't put him in this section because he's born in the 1850s, I think. So he's a little bit later than the period we're talking about now. But we're going to look at him in a second. Um, so the Prince Regent was a dandy. He lived an extravagant lifestyle. Whenever we talk about sort of the excesses of the monarchy, we can kind of look at the Sun King Louis XIV. We can look at Louis XV a little bit, and then we could super look at George IV. He became regent in 1811. So he had all of the powers of the king without the title. So he was in charge of the government after his father was declared insane. If you've never seen the movie The Madness of King George, it's spectacular. You should really, really see it. It is about King George the Fourth, or King George the Third going crazy. He is the king that oversaw the American Revolution. So that is part of it as well. So he loved spectacle. He loved parades. He loved furniture. He loved dressing well. He loved women. He um, he had a huge collection of paintings and furniture that went into the National Gallery. He was involved with the redesign of Buckingham Palace, of Windsor Castle, and the Brighton Pavilion. So he was dissolute, but he was well educated. His parents didn't like him very much because his parents were very sort of strict and somber, and he was not. He wanted to go out and have a good time. He was handsome. He was popular. He loved gambling. He became king in 1820 when his father George died. He did not have any children that survived. He had one Princess Charlotte, but she died in childbirth. So his line went to his brother's son, his nephew, I think. Um, but he had this way about him that was just people wanted to be the man of England, I think is what they called him. Here's some images of him, sort of perfectly put together, perfectly coiffed. But after a while, this is a parody, sort of like political cartoon of him, but he turned corpulent, he turned fatto. So just because of living bad, he probably had gout. He probably had a bad heart. He didn't take care of himself. He just wanted to party all the time. One of his best friends was Beau Brummel. Um, when you think of dandy, you think of Beau Brummel. He was the arbiter of fashion, so people looked to him for trends in menswear, sort of understated but exquisitely cut clothes. So plain but really well put together. Um, so he sort of started the suit and tie look. So get used to staring at this image because this is the birth of the men's suit. Um, and this is where it starts. He claimed to take 5 hours to dress. He recommended that boots be polished with champagne. Um, it became known as dandyism. And here's another image of sort of the dandies. Um, some of the fabrics that we see a lot in this time period is chintz, cambric, printed batiste, crepe, um, airy nets, gauzes. Indian muslins were really, really, really popular because, again, you see most of the clothing that we started talking about were very thin, were very sheer almost. So these Indian muslins they disappear. They become less popular and are used as sort of accent pieces. We're going to go back to seeing lots of satins and taffetas coming up here after like 1830. But for most of the late 1700s, early 1800s, it's muslin is the main fabric. We see a little bit of wool, merino wool, super warm. Satins and velvets were accents, not necessarily the clothes themselves, and gowns. White was the most popular color. We're starting to see more and more colors come in 1820. Fabrics, prints, and colors change as quickly as the style of clothing did. Um, Materials and colors were named from events and books. The Trocadero, bronze, smoke, Nile water, solitary, amorous toad, frightened mouse. Some of the strangest names that were created. And this kind of goes along with the creation of synthetic dyes, that if you could have any color you wanted, you could sort of name it any color you want. A friend of mine once said that he wants a job naming lipsticks, kind of the same thing, that it's any color so you can name it anything. Paisley became immensely popular. Sort of, the idea of paisley came from India and was um, co-opted by a company in Scotland that started. It's Paisley, Scotland, and started creating these large shawls. We'll see in a lot of the images that the shawl is sort of the accent piece for, especially in the Empire and the Directoire era, where the main dress was white with a little bit of embroidery or accents, and then you wore this fabulous paisley shawl all over everything. Mostly because you're not wearing much of anything, so you're probably cold a lot. The first giraffe was shown to the Western world in the Gardin des Plantes in 1827. And so we see the giraffe pattern appear in clothing, a la giraffe. Furs were used for trimming, short jackets, muffs. Muffs, these are these sort of hand warmers. I really wish these would come back because that would be really super awesome. They were made from sealskin, beaver, sable, mink, Persian lamb, just about anything. And again, the more exotic, the better. We're going to talk about underpinnings a little bit more tomorrow whenever we get to um, the clothing that needs a lot more understructure. We don't see a lot of sort of shapers or changes to the silhouette in in the clothing for this first period until we get to about 1820. But starting tomorrow, we're going to see a lot of it. Jewelry was becoming very, very important. You'll notice a little neoclassical look here, very, uh, very Roman style of jewelry. Again, um, early century was really, really simple. So just earrings and a necklace of pearls, but they became more and more elaborate. Cameos became really, really popular, which is that little uh, portrait view of a person. This is a cameo right here. They were carved of ivory or marble or whatever, alabaster, another one. And you saw them on brooches or scarf holders or on your hair, on your sleeves, just about anywhere. If you could, if it, we're coming up to a time period that it, again, if it stood still, it was going to get decorated. And the 19th century saw the rise of the jewelry designer. So we see Nito for Napoleon. So these are Josephine's jewels for the inauguration or for her crowning. Um, and Nito, Etienne Nito did coronation crown and swords and all these important pieces. And you should recognize some of these names: Tiffany, Cartier, Bulgari, Fabergé, Chaumet. I don't really know much about, but the Tiffany, Cartier, Bulgari, and Fabergé are companies that are still around today. So this is a Tiffany piece, a Cartier piece, and a Fabergé of the egg. And one of the last really important pieces of accessories for women, you'll notice that the accessories for men is a hat, is a stock, which is the neckerchief, and a walking stick and gloves. They're pretty simple, but women had, they had jewelry and they had a reticule. A lot of those sort of very sheer gowns did not have pockets, so they would make little purses, little carry bags. And this was another way, as we see, women's labor changes drastically with the mechanization of clothing manufacture. So often bourgeoisie, upper middle class, upper class, and aristocratic women lost their employment. They would have servants that took care of the house for them. They had nannies that took care of children for them. So a lot of their time was taken up with sort of social life, partially social life, which was visiting. We're going to talk about that in a second when we get to look at the amount of times women had to change clothes in a day, um, and partially taken up with uh, kind of taken up with the creation of little things. So quill work, um, hair jewelry, hair ornaments. The cult of death is coming up here in a second with Victorian, especially when Victoria loses Albert. It sort of changes how uh, mourning for a person happens. And this sort of beadwork and putting things under glass is what women did. This drawing and playing music became really, really important. The artistry became a marketable skill for women for being married. So these are little bags that they would make. So let's talk about men's clothing in the late 18th century. Just became simplified after sort of the early and mid 18th century. We're losing all the ornament because, again, if you wore ornament, you would probably be killed. Longer breeches were eventually replaced by trousers, pantaloons. You see waistcoats. This is sort of this is 1895, so a little cockade up there, huh? So the waistcoat, the coat with the smaller cuffs, the wider lapels, big fold over collar. The coats become useful, not useful. There are waves of coats and jackets like this that are useful and not useful. This is a non-useful. You can't really button this too much. And this is a cutaway coat, probably if he was standing, probably square. Breeches are probably made of leather. That's how they get this tight. Boots and the beginnings of a top hat. This is George Washington, The Washington Family by Edward Savage, painted in the like 1890, mid 1890. But you see sort of the, again, this is called a stocks, high turnover collar, sort of curving lapels, uh, single breasted. We're going to talk about that in a second. Probably leather breeches. Um, and you'll notice that children's clothing, we don't spend a lot of time on children's clothing, but children's clothing was fairly the same. We see this sort of very naturalistic, a little bit of underpinnings here, little underpinnings here, but sort of we're moving towards that sort of neoclassical look. Here is again coat, vest, breeches. Get used to that. So this coat is a little more formal because it is a cutaway, as we saw in the last century. It is again probably not meant to be buttoned, but standing collar, and this is a stocks or a cravat. Breeches again fit snugly, probably made of leather. Here we go a little bit more fancy. So that this coat is the lapels of the coat are huge, the buttons are huge, the sleeves are really tight, leather breeches, little bit of decoration on this, and starting to see a little more lace. And you can just see the waistcoat in here. That the waistcoat doesn't necessarily match. Um, so we're seeing like the waistcoat. We can't really see his waistcoat, but in here, that they're of the same color family, probably of different materials. This one is definitely of three different. So this is probably wool. This is probably uh, cotton, and this is leather. So they're in three different materials. And we're starting to see that the waistcoat doesn't is a different pattern. We're going to see that a lot coming up. Um, but diagonal grain, we're starting to see bias cut become more popular. And the coat sort of swings towards the back once they're naturally laid towards the back. It's smoothly. So this is a Spencer jacket. This goes away. This sort of tails disappear, and we see it sort of sit right above the hips, right on the hips here. Again, probably not meant to be closed, and it looks like this one's probably made out of a cotton or a linen This one looks like it's made out of velvet or wool. Um, the lapels, and there's not a lot of lapels in the Spencer jacket. These lapels belong to the waistcoat that we see here. Um, Keep an eye on this. Again, this is sort of one more nail in the coffin of men's fashion in the 20th century. This is sort of the coat that we're going to see a lot of coming up. Men wore cravats and or stocks and jabots, which is that sort of tied thing. And as the century closed, they became more and more and more elaborate, as we saw, especially with the Incroyable de Mavu. Hose were plain, shoes were the same shape. We start to see shoelaces, which is fantastic, and the shoe buckle disappears. And again, sort of no wig, but this Roman look. And here's a bunch of different types of stocks and ties and how folding folding your collars. So men's costume from 1800 to 1820 didn't really change. We're starting to see more. I'm sorry, this picture is terrible. Um, that men's clothing is less about leisure and war and more about business and industry, because business and industry with the industrial revolution, more and more men are going into trade, and so their clothes have to bear up to it. So they have to be able to shed and conceal dirt and soot and be hard wearing, withstand travel, that don't get wrinkled, that they're really sturdy. um, Satin, lace, delicate colors disappear. Uh, Colored worsted and plain linen. So jackets and pantaloons again remain tightly fitted, but we sort of see them loosen. We're going to see them loosen coming up in about mid-century to permit freer movement again because of industry. Uh, Tailored wool uh, garments become the backbone of the men's wardrobe. Fine cut tailoring, perfect fit, grooming and manners become really, really important. Beau Brummel. Um, Men's costume becomes thinner in the line, that they're not as bulky, and no decoration. Uh, by mid 19th century, we see sort of a dull, dark uniform dress. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? So men of this era, of this early 19th century era, wore a crisp shirt collar, a neat cravat, which is this right here, a high collared waistcoat, which is this here. So this is the waistcoat here. Uh, a high collared waistcoat, which is this is here. The coat was smooth rolling collar and lapels. This one doesn't. This one has lapels right here. You can see tight sleeves. This is going to change shortly, and tight breeches. And sometimes you'll see longer trousers shortly. So trousers were either short and baggy or skin tight. You'll often see shirts with double ruffles and necks encircled with uh, white, perfect white linen cravat. And the waistcoats are only the kind of become the only decorative piece to the costume, to their outfits. So we see an overcoat called a garrick appear. Just think of uh, Jacob uh, Jacob Marley, not Marley. What is his name? It was just Christmas and I can't remember his name. So there's the top hat and shoes. Boots were outdoors, shoes were indoors, and here's shoelaces. So this is what a period shoe would look like, kind of slipper-ish. Um, Scrooge, that's his name. Again, some more images of what men were wearing in that time period. Women's clothes in 1890s, 1790s, 1810. Less inner structure, fewer undergarments, fullness of the backside disappeared, no hip fullness, so we don't see a bustle or the robe a la francais, which had all that fullness in the back. And so we see more of a tubular silhouette, and decoration kind of disappears. In the 1790s, we see an S curve, which is the pigeon breast and pronounced derriere, but again, that's disappearing quickly. Skirts were relatively plain, and all of this bulk was achieved with gauze and a fichu, which is this piece right here, the fichu here. Recognize this. We're going to see this sort of S bend again towards the end of the century, end of the 19th century. And this fullness was achieved with padding and multiple petticoats, but this is all going to disappear and become this. So during the Republic and while the Terror was underway, this sort of unstructured cotton dress, drawstring neckline, the fichu, the scarf goes in here, sort of based on the chemise dress. We're trying to look like Greeks and Romans, um, and very narrow silhouette with what we call now an empire waist. Clinging fabrics, so lots of chintz, lots of India muslins. Very little. You'll notice that there's not a lot of decoration on this. Again, as men's clothes went plainer, so did women's clothes. This doesn't last long. Women's clothes are going to be more and more decorated here shortly. Dresses were fastened with tapes or cords, so not a lot of big buttons, not a lot of, well, we don't have zippers yet, but not a lot of those closures. Again, little cap sleeves. And these are have trains, so they were probably for evening wear. So Greek and Roman sculpture inspired the style of the directoire. So muslin or chintz, as I've said before. Um, English styles were way more modest. French styles were a little more daring, showed off a little more chest, as it were. This is a Josephine, Empress Josephine of the First Empire. This is one of her dresses that she wore. So a little high collar here with a fill-in of muslin, and then a dress with an overlay, a sheer overlay with lace. Kind of simple, elegant, but still showing a lovely beauty to it. French styles were plainer but more revealing, as we see here that the distance between the neckline and the waistline were a matter of inches. And so you see muslin, translucent muslin, very light layers. Um, Not a lot of sleeves, so these were kind of just little capulette sleeves here. Um, Very natural form, which sort of goes whenever you're trying to not be nobility, when you're trying to be plain, this is what you get. So this is that long scarf that was part of the uniform, this sort of long uh, wool or linen or cotton scarf with um, exotic banding. You see, this is hers here. I think this is a statue. This is a painting of Empress Josephine as well. You'll notice little slipper-like shoes. Again, sort of Roman-esque. They probably tied at the ankle, um, and this huge banding with tassels. We saw the Spencer coat, just like the men's style. This is a Spencer coat. If you've ever seen Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice, or one of Jane Austen's, this is the outfit that they would wear. This was very much this time period of Jane Austen. So, sort of plain muslin, a little bit of ruffle around the neck. You see a little ruffle around the neck, and then this sort of high waisted coat, simple coat. Underwear was reduced to a minimum. Probably had some corsets in there to kind of keep you in shape. Here is the sort of uh, Indian style. This is a palm mimics a palm leaf, so a paisley style here. But you'll notice again, kind of very fancy, just a little bit of embroidery around it, a little bit of embroidery on the base, and very simple tied shoes. We do see bonnets, caps, and turbans coming back. Hair is very Roman. We see this on Roman statues. Um, Women also could wear sandals or go barefoot. Powdered hair was right out. Short hair was in. Also loose and curly. Sort of. I I had this hairstyle actually. Go figure. Gloves, minimal jewelry, and then they wore hats and bonnets, as we see here, were kind of little mob caps or lace bonnets were very popular. So this is sort of the early 20th, early 19th century family right there. So women's clothing, 1811 to 1820. Um, we see a little more bulky, a little more ornamental. The introduction of color comes back. So the necklines came back up and the sleeves became really, really full. And the waistline came up even more, if that's possible. Uh, Evening and formal dresses, the shoulders were a big thing. You'll notice that we don't show off a lot of ankle. The silhouette for the 19th century is about revealing and concealing. What are we revealing and what are we concealing? Well, it's kind of the silhouette of all clothing history, really. But so in this silhouette, we reveal shoulders. In the earlier silhouette, we revealed shoulders and decolletage. So we're scooching back up to cover up the top here, but we see the birth of bigger sleeves and we see the birth of bigger bottom down here, and this is going to go crazy. And again, you see that ubiquitous shawl there that every woman owned. Fabrics became heavier, became firmer, a little more patterned, a little more decorated. So we're starting to see the introduction of lace. Again, these sleeves are going to go atomic here in a second. A little bit of lace on the bottom, and gold decorations. Borders became really important. Ruffles, padded rolls to kind of puff out that bottom a little bit. We're going to see that a little bit more as we go towards the mid-century. Uh, Women wore gloves everywhere. I was thinking about gloves not too long ago. So why gloves? I mean, you wore gloves to protect your hands, but most of these women were not doing labor. So why gloves? Let's think on that. They would wear Betsy's, which is sort of these double ruffs, which were kind of common. The Cherokee was this sort of high pleated collar as well. This is going to come back. We'll see this again in the early 20th century as well. So the next period we're going to talk about is 1820 1850, and this is the Romantic period. So whereas we see in neoclassicism that it is very formal, it is very precise, it is based on that sort of Greek uh, and Roman ideal of perfection, of simplicity and perfection, what they perceive was the neoclassical ideal. What we see in the Romantic period is this sort of individualism, is the glorification of the past and of nature, of that there's no rules, we can do whatever. So imagination over reason, emotions over logic, intuition over science. And these were all reactions to what's going on in society, of course, like always. Um, the zeitgeist of an age is always a reaction to what has gone before or what is going on at this time. So, this idea of the glorification of nature is a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, that this highly mechanized machine. We're going to see in the future that the reaction to this sort of so romanticism kind of turns into arts and crafts period, kind of turns into a couple other things. We're going to see in the 1920s, sort of love of mechanization. Futurism becomes really popular, and like the steamship and the bicycle, and machinery becomes really popular again. So we're always in this sort of cyclical relationship with our past and our future. And we see that in this Romantic period. For those of you who have studied any literature, this is Byron, this is Keats, this is Shelley, this is Wordsworth, this is the ideal of the passionate loner, of the person who is in love with nature. Um, in theater, there is a great, so in neoclassical theater, especially in France. I'm a theater professor, so this is totally my jam. Um, we have the what is called the well-made play, that plays, this Moliere is neoclassicism. So plays were a certain length, they had to act a certain way, they had to, and you could get in trouble if you broke these rules. You had to have the time of the play had to be how long it took to do the play, and you couldn't go from I'm going to be in Paris, France. Oh wait, next scene I'm in America. You couldn't do that. There were very specific rules and it was based on ancient Greek drama. Um, in the Romantic period, we have plays like Ernani, which was about revenge and ghosts and murder and stabbing and excitement. We see Three Musketeers is a play of this time. We see Les Mis was written at this time period. Um, I think Wagner is coming up. Just you wait. If you want romanticism, just you wait. So we see romanticism in our literature. We see romanticism in our paintings. This is Caspar David Friedrich. Um, kind of, this is the painting that sort of encapsulates the romantic hero, the Byronic hero, for those of you who are lit people. Um, sort of, so this is the difference between to look at between neoclassicism and romanticism in portraiture. So this is Antoine Laurent Lavoisier and his wife by J.L. David, 1788. Very neoclassical, perfectly put together and proportional, and even the trappings are neoclassical with the columns in the back. Um, Romanticism, and now romanticism, as we think about romanticism in art, we're looking forward to sort of we're looking forward to impressionism, to Monet, Manet, Toulouse-Lautrec. We're looking forward into sort of the art that changes what we see, because prior to this, most art, this is kind of the last quote unquote realistic style of art that is ascendant. Um, what we're going to see soon is art that is non-realistic, and that sort of explodes what people, that art that reflects the inner man, not the outer world. And that's going to turn everything on its head. So these are the two. This is an example of the two different styles that we're looking at. Another thing that becomes really, really popular at this time is the revival. This was again something the Romantics really liked. They wanted to go back. They wanted to look to antiquity, not just neoclassicism, not to just Greek and Roman, but medieval. They wanted to the Renaissance, the Gothic medieval. Um, what became really, really, really inspiring for sort of what they're writing. We see the rebirth of the Petruchin sonnet. Um, we see the sort of pastoral writings. I was, if anyone didn't tell, I was an English lit major in college, so I don't remember much of it, but there's some things that stick, especially in Romanticism. And so we see the revival in architecture, art, literature. The historical novel by Sir Walter Scott, Ivanhoe, is invented at this time, and fashion. So we see sort of, again, this echo of, so this is Gothic revival dress. It's a little later than what we're talking about right now in this period, but kind of has the same sort of, this is a Gothic revival. We see medieval revival in the arts and crafts period, which is coming up shortly. Um, and in architecture. If you've ever been to Oshkosh and gone to the Kohler Art Center and gone into the house that's part of the Kohler Art Center, that's a revival house. A lot of the historical buildings of this time were built in Victorian age, and so they're revivals. If you go across the river to the other side of De Pere, you'll see a lot of revivals over there. Um, Italian Renaissance, the Italian revival, again, so this might look familiar, sort of the Italianate style, the Renaissance style, still done up in modern, in 19th century, and then this is an Italian Renaissance um, building. Men's clothes became even more sober, darkish blues, black, brown, light plaids, and plaids. Not a lot of color, not a lot of surface decoration anymore. Didn't really see that at all. Women's clothing went in the other direction. Elaborate colors, patterns, textures. You see more and more of it becoming more widespread and enormous, very fanciful. We also see this thing called tuberculosis chic. Now, tuberculosis was kind of ravaging uh, Europe and the Americas. And tuberculosis was kind of like a lung disease that made you waste away. But as you wasted away, you became more and more beautiful. Think of Edgar Allan Poe, that, Annabelle Lee, that sort of pale, translucent porcelain skin and really fine silky hair, and your eyes were sparkling and bright and dilating. You had rosy cheeks and red lips. It was because you were running a fever most of the time from tuberculosis, and you would die young. A little bit of blood on your on your handkerchief, and you would die. So this is the Lady of the Camels. This is a famous French courtesan that stories were written of. So Madame Bovary and well, Rent. If you guys know the musical Rent, um, this was sort of Rent was based on a La Boheme, which was the main female character was a woman who had tuberculosis, and she was the most beautiful creature in France, and uh, she died of tuberculosis, but she was gorgeous while she was dying from it. So, you know, we're dying of tuberculosis, but and I have a couple articles in our supplementary material, our supplementary links if you want to read more about this. Men and women in 1821, 1849, we see lots of shoulders, and we start to widen out in the bottom as well to amplify that very wasp waist. The wasp waist will come back for most of the 19th century. Rest of the 19th century, it becomes really, really, really important. Um, Hips were made to look rounded, so we see even in men the tails or the peplum of this outfit makes you look like you have a rounded hips and rounded waist, and then these large, enormous, uh, padded chest and padded shoulder pads and upper sleeves, and we see that especially in women. Super sleeves are becoming more and more popular. So this is 1840s here again, wasp waist. There's an image in our book that has a person, a gentleman being corseted. So men were starting to wear corsets so they could get this shape as well. Um, and then this kind of fullness at the bottom. So men and women's clothing, the shape echoed, not necessarily the materials. And so we see this is an extant piece. Men's, this is called a leg of mutton sleeve. So it has, if you've ever seen like a leg of mutton, a leg of lamb, basically, it's this sort of, so this is the bottom of the leg, and then this is the meat part. These sort of sleeves were popular. We'll see those again. Don't worry. And this is sort of the monstrosities of 1822. Um, a lot of the extremism that we're going to see, we can kind of really see in political cartoons that are satirizing fashion. And it's really funny that they put sort of neoclassicism up on a pedestal above this sort of classical beauty next to this sort of ridiculous what people look like at this time period, what they think that people are looking at this time period. So men's clothes at 1820 to 1849. Tailcoats were the most popular type of coat, so they were double-breasted and single-breasted, which we'll take a look at in a second. I'll show you what that means. Um, Close to the waist, as we see here, very close to the waist, and tapered to the wrist, so they got tighter as they went down. They didn't really have those big cuffs that we've seen, but they had enormous lapels. Waistcoats were still decorative. Sometimes men wore two or three of them underneath, so a white one and then it's a little stripy one underneath. But the outer coat, the outer jacket was very plain. Again, sort of the leg of mutton sleeves with the width. Uh, Pantaloons were trousers. Now we're starting to call them trousers. They were stirrup, so they kind of look peg-legged. So a fullness at the hips. Again, at which made a slender waist, an hourglass figure almost, and lots of pleats. So pleats is a fullness of fabric. So what we're seeing here, double-breasted. So double-breasted is two buttons, two rows of buttons, peg-legged, pleated, pleated waist, cutaway square cutaway top coat, and leg of mutton sleeves. The pants are stirrups down here, and you'll see shoelaces, a top hat. So the frock coat is becoming more and more popular at this time. If you look at it, it looks kind of familiar, almost like what men wear today. If you cut this off about here, you're going to have a suit coat. Um, Usually black, usually made out of hard wearing material. You'll notice that the waistcoat underneath it is white, so your fancy stuff is still underneath, especially if you're going into the factories, especially if you're going into warehouses. You want something that's going to stand up to a little bit of dirt and soot and kind of yuckiness. So long sleeves, fitted throughout. A center vent, that means there's a split in the back. That's what a center vent is. And a waist seam right here, so that you can really cinch your waist up pretty good. Again, that sort of idea of broad shoulder waist. We're going to see this again in the 20th century as well for men suits. Came into popularity 1820s, never went away. So eventually, what we see is the frock coat is the day wear, tailcoats are the evening wear. So to do a smidge of a lesson on suits. We're going to talk about them more when we get to the 20th century, when we start to see suits the way we know suits to be. So this is single-breasted. It does not mean what's up here. It just means how many buttons it has. So single-breasted is single row of buttons. Double-breasted is double row of buttons, so it overlaps more. And we also talk about when we talk about lapels. So this is the lapel here. It's part of the suit that flips over, and we've seen lapels a lot. So this is a peak where it kind of comes up in a point. This is a standard notch. The shawl has no notches. Wide peak is this sort of, it's fatter along here. You'll notice how sort of narrow this piece is. This is how wide it is here. Narrow notch, there's not a lot of material in here. And then a wide notch is a lot of material in here. This is a lapel buttonhole, or a lapel slit, so where that's where you put your boutonniere, your flower. And we don't see where these will appear later on. We don't have these right now. So men wore a stiff cravat and ties with a tailored bow, so a big fluffy thing up here. You'll notice we have the colorful waistcoat. This is a watch fob here, so his pocket watch would be there. Double-breasted right here, and you'll notice a little bit of lace. These look like leather pants, and he's wearing boots, half boots, or we would see the dressy outfit a little bit later for evening wear. Some of the coats we already saw this a little bit, but this is the Garrick coat right here, which is lots and lots of ruffles, lots of capes. This is the Great Coat, which is just one big cape. And then we're starting to see the Chesterfield coat. Again, this is the coat that we're going to see for a very, very long time. We're also seeing a diversification of hats. The birth of the hat, you had to wear a hat to go out, became apparent in the 19th century and throughout mid-century, 20th century. So this is the silk top hat. This is the gibbous hat, which is the collapsible silk top hat. This is the derby hat, or derby hat in America, bowler in Britain. Sort of flat caps. People still wear these today. And then a smoking cap, which is, you would wear this with your banyan for inside. And there's this interesting thing that happens in the 19th century, is that you have intimacy of clothes. So depending on where you are in public depends on where you are seen. So what you're wearing for scene. So if you're in your bedroom, you're in the least amount of clothes. You had sort of going out clothes, and then you had staying in clothes. So if you were a guy and you were receiving guests in a more intimate occasion, not intimate like sexy, but intimate like smoking lounge, sort of friendly chat, you would wear something almost like a house robe, a banyan, but that covered up your outside coat, And it was a little more, and you would wear your smoking cap. Women had the same way, but women had, as we'll see in a second, women had lots and lots and lots of changes to do. So this was men's way of showing off wealth by having an elaborate banyan. And we'll look at the banyans next tomorrow. So you could buy your hat from Sears and Roebuck. You could just order, and I found this in my research, the different types of baseball caps, and I thought that was the best thing I've ever seen in my life, so I decided to pop it in. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about women. Women's overview. So 1820, 1849. As we moved from sort of our very neoclassical naturalistic look, we start to see more and more underpinnings, more padded. We're starting to change the shape again. So chemises, this is a chemise. It's just kind of like an underdress. Often you couldn't wash your outer dresses as often as you would like, so you would wear a chemise, and the chemise would be made out of like plain cotton or wool, depending on the time period, depending on the season, and that would catch like sweat and the body odors. So you would be able to wash this fairly easily, less easily, and you could wash your petticoats and your bustles, this sort of what we call in theater the skin parts, the stuff that's closest to your skin. You would wash those often, and wear new often, but uh, you wouldn't necessarily wash the outer, the main dresses, your gowns. So this is petticoat, chemise, and bustle here. Draws are like pants, pantaloons, bloomers. That's what they're called. You would also dress to specific day, time, and event because this is part of the sort of women's leisure, is being able to dress and go out and be seen. So this was a showing of wealth. And we've seen this in the past that we want to show our wealthy. We want to show our um, the conspicuous leisure, conspicuous consumption. So women would be required, quote unquote, required, especially if they were of a certain class, to dress in certain ways throughout the day. Also, they would be um, receiving, so you would wear your morning dress for breakfast, for morning chores, for receiving guests. If you were going out visiting, you would wear a separate dress. If you were in a carriage versus walking. Again, think of Jane Austen, read Jane Austen, how often they change. Um, it's part of, it's like really interesting. I think it's kind of fascinating how much women change. We don't really do that today. Probably like we would wear something to school, something different to work. When we get home, we would put on our jammies or our house clothes, and then we would change into something to go to bed. But it's not as necessary. So this is morning dresses. You'll notice that it's a little less formal, a little looser fitting. But again, you're still probably seeing guests, so you would have to wear your best. Afternoon day dresses, so a little more elaborate because you would probably be visiting or going out to different places. Walking dresses, you'll notice that they're a little more sturdy around the bottom, so that if you're going out hoofing it, running, you would probably wear this with a plissé, which was a little bit of an overcoat. Um, and then the carriage dress, so that you can get in and out of carriages well. And dinner dresses. This is one of the dresses we were talking about that they started to have more fabric at the bottom so that it held them in place. So this woman wouldn't necessarily wear much more than a petticoat or two, but you'll notice that all of this fabric at the bottom is kind of holding it stiff. So again, a couple different dinner dresses. And then this is the evening gown. So court dress and then an evening gown for dancing mostly. So you notice that you can't really tell much difference between them. I mean, you could tell a little difference by the decoration, by how elaborate they are, by what they're made out of. But again, just like a lot of other things, that if you are part of this culture, you'll know if somebody is wearing a carriage dress or a walking dress. You'll know the difference between the two. You'll know the difference between a dinner dress and an evening gown. And you would judge somebody by what they wore. So what we see often in the early of the 1820s, 1830s is tight bodice with, we start to see, again, here is our puffiness that holds this skirt out. So a tighter bodice, getting bigger on the sleeves, and we're starting to see that sort of um, birth of the hoop skirt that's coming up really soon. This sort of enormous hoop skirt. Shoulder seams are lengthened, so we're starting to fall off of the shoulders a little bit. And necklines, we're starting to see more necklines come up and ruffles. This is an image, a terrible image from the Kyoto Institute of sleeve padding. So if you have sleeves like this, you probably had an underpinning to help poof them out a good bit. And then we start to see skirt bottoms being more and more decorated. Um, so sleeves and skirts. So you're making a figure, so like an not even an hourglass, but kind of like a funnel or two inverted triangles. That's what it is. So two inverted triangles with a point in the middle. Fullness at the hemline and horizontal decoration typified this era. So you have lots of decoration down here, lots of, and the hair had a center part and curls were bunched on either side, as you see in this one. And slippers were still sort of popular. Here's some more images of the hair. So split in the middle, lots of fullness on either side, and then probably a fall. This is probably all fake or built on wicker work. A basket, and you just tie the hair around the basket. Another one, so very full sleeves, very decorated bottom, and this sort of tiny, tiny waist. So again, inverted two triangles, points meeting in the middle. So women in 1830s, 1849, so the shoulders became extremely wide. This is the leg of mutton sleeves here. So we're seeing lots and lots and lots of material up there. So we're seeing bigger and bigger skirts. Again, tiny waistline. The waistline is still pretty high on the, so this waistline's falling right under the rib cage here. So the natural waist is probably here. The hips are here. So this is still right up at the ribs. Clothing became heavier and heavier and more constricting. Um, we're starting to see the beginning of the ridiculous corset tree that that was very dangerous at the time period. Bodices are varied, so this is that large shoulder seam, the very and weird looking things, tight waist and decoration at the bottom, little slipper under there, and weird hair. This time period always reminds me of, you remember the Disney Cinderella? What the two stepsisters wore? This always reminds me of that style. So V-neck, broad necklines were common. We're not showing off a lot of décolletage, the top of the breast, but we are showing off sort of swan neck and expansive collarbones and shoulders. Sleeves almost overpower the dress again, and we're starting to see this hemline start to, um, the hemline decorations are starting to disappear, but we're starting to see them poof out. And then here's some of the underpinnings. So this is a period corset that sort of shrunk the waist here. This is a horsehair petticoat. The reason they use horsehair is because it's very coarse and it holds its shape really well. And then, so this is the corset and a petticoat combo. Crinolines is another thing. We'll see crinolines more and more after 1850, but we're starting to see crinolines come into their own. Hair style kind of on either side, and we see accessories. So we're seeing lots of shawls, lots of hair decorations, lots of bonnets, ruffle white cap. We're starting to see more and more jewelry and furs be apparent. So we are rocket shipping away from the simplicity of the early 19th century. And here's some very funny hairstyles that I adore. Here's a couple more that it's sort of braided. And this reminds me of, again, not only just Cinderella, but also reminds me of sort of the ridiculous hairstyles of the 18th century as well, sort of braided and piled up on the top of the hair. Some of our modern influences, this sort of empire waist and sheer drop. We see this in a lot of wedding dresses, especially now. The wedding dresses have become simpler. We're going to take a look at whenever we start to get into later 19th century, we'll take a look at wedding dresses that have echoed later 19th century with lots of crinoline, lots of underpinnings, lots of sort of things underneath. Um, we also see this sort of maxi dress style that was really popular earlier last year, 2 years ago. That sort of we see that in the empire. So this is the empire waist that was really popular. Again, look at this decolletage and high waisted. You know, the waistband and the top of the neckline are inches apart. Men's suits, we're not going to see a lot of changes to men's suits. They're just going to get more and more rigid, but the idea of the dandy has come back to us. The sort of very well put together man is becoming more and more popular. But this suit, holy crap, I could put next to an 19th century suit, and we're starting to see not a difference. But again, this sort of gorgeous, gorgeous echo to throwback to the early 19th century. Okay, so tomorrow we're going to talk about the late 19th century. Thank you very much.